one of the most dramatic moments, not only in the Bible, but perhaps in all of humanity's history, took place in a location we commonly refer to in our culture as the upper room. It happened at the end of Jesus' ministry. Some of you may know the story, but we've all heard bits and pieces of it. Jesus and his disciples had come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover together. Now, the Passover was a meal, a kind of feast, but it was a memorial meal where the Jewish people gathered to eat and remember what had happened hundreds of years earlier to the Israelites in Egypt's slavery. The Israelites had their last meal in Egypt, and the next morning they would leave. And for over 400 years, they had lived in Egypt as a group of people as slaves. It all started with one family, Jacob and his 12 sons, which grew into a nation. And from the beginning, all they knew was slavery. And they prayed and prayed to their God, but for over 400 years, their prayers remained unanswered. We pray for 4 days, and then we wonder if there's a God. But the Israelites, their prayers went unanswered for 400 years. Eventually, God sent them a deliverer, Moses. Moses told them that the angel of death would pass over Egypt and kill every firstborn in every household if they did not have blood of the lamb on their doorposts. So the Israelites believed Moses. So every family slaughtered a lamb, had a meal, and then smeared the blood on their doorposts. And that night, the angel of death passed over Egypt. The next morning, Pharaoh said, "Please, just leave my country, you may go." So that was their last meal, their last supper, the last time Israelite families gathered together in Egypt. The next day, they packed everything they owned, along with all the valuables the Egyptians had given them. The Bible says they left Egypt loaded with wealth. They departed Egypt and journeyed towards the promised land. Now, about 1,300 plus years after that event, Jesus was celebrating the Passover meal with his disciples. They had observed Passover many times before, but this time it was different. There was a time when they gathered for the Passover meal and everything was going well. Jesus was a star, a celebrity, a cultural icon. Thousands gathered to hear him speak, and the disciples felt honored to be at his side. Everything was great. Jesus' movement had momentum. Crowds were growing bigger and bigger, and the miracles were becoming greater and greater. But now, in the upper room, as they gathered together for this meal, what we know as the Last Supper, things were not going well. The momentum had shifted. Rumors were circulated that a group of people was trying to capture Jesus, aiming to isolate him from the crowd so they could arrest him on various charges. And the disciples knew that if Jesus was taken, they would be next. And to make things worse, Jesus started speaking about his death, about how he would be taken away. Now, I think they filtered it out somewhat because in their minds, just like in ours, if God is with you, if God is working through you, if God is moving around you, then things should get better, right? Because where God is, there should be more certainty, not less certainty, right? But here were the disciples finding themselves in a moment where things were simply not going well. There was much more uncertainty. And what's going on? I mean, even on the way to Jerusalem, Jesus had said, if I go to Jerusalem, things are going to get really, really badly. And obviously, just like we would, they wondered, then why are we going to Jerusalem? It seems like Jesus had a death wish, like he was walking straight into the jaws of death. But Jesus told his disciples, things are going to get bad when we arrived in Jerusalem. Follow me. And they reached the outskirts of Jerusalem and stopped and waited for the sun to set. Then Jesus sent 2 disciples into the town to meet a mysterious man who would take them to a secret place. And under the cover of night, they sneaked into Jerusalem. No big celebration, no shouting of crowds, none of the excitement they previously experienced. Then they arrived at this strange house, climbed up into the upper room, and everything just felt odd. Everything was uncertain. There was no certainty whatsoever. And if that wasn't unsettling enough, Jesus started the conversation like this. And we read this in Mark 14. In the evening, Jesus arrived with the 12. As they were at the table eating, Jesus said, I tell you the truth. One of you eating with me here will betray me. Literally, one of you around here at this table, you will hand me over. And the momentum had shifted. Things weren't going well anymore. They knew Jesus was now a wanted man. And then Jesus said, one of you eating here with me, you are going to betray me. Now, eating with me, this emphasizes the insult, because in that culture, sharing a meal with someone was much like sharing a meal in our culture. It would be like having someone close to you at your house and saying, in fact, I know you are going to betray me. They were in the most intimate setting possible for that time, just like in our culture. And yet Jesus said, one of you who is eating with me, one of you will betray me. So the story continues. Shocked, they each ask him one by one, surely it's not me? Jesus answered them. He replied, it is one of you 12 who is eating from this bowl with me, for the Son of Man must die, as the scriptures declare long ago. But how terrible it would be for the one who betrayed me. It would be far better for that man if he had never been born. Sure. Mark 14 verse 22 reads, as they were eating, Jesus took some bread and blessed it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to his disciples, saying, take it, for this is my body. Men, you have always, since childhood, eaten this bread. But from now on, whenever you eat it, remember, this is my body, broken for you. What do you mean, Jesus? This is your body? Again, all this talk of death, all this negativity. We don't want to hear this. If you are from God, shouldn't things be different? Shouldn't things be more positive? If you're from God, shouldn't there be more certainty, not less? But Jesus wasn't finished yet. Listen. Then he took a cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. He gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, this is my blood, which confirms the covenant between God and his people. It is poured out as a sacrifice for many. Jesus paints the picture of what will happen just hours later when he will be nailed to a cross and die before their very eyes. And then they leave the upper room and go to the Garden of Gethsemane, the place where so much drama unfolds, the place where Jesus himself prays, Father, can this cup be taken away from me? In other words, I don't want to go through what I'm about to go through. And finally, Jesus is arrested. And as he is being led to his trial, the tragic words of Mark 14 verse 27 came true. All of you will desert me, Jesus told them. For the scripture says, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. Can you imagine what must have been going through the disciples' mind when Jesus said this? And then Jesus continues, saying something even stranger. But after I am raised from the dead, I will go ahead to you to Galilee and meet you there. But Peter had enough. Enough negativity, enough bad news, enough talk of death or arrest or betrayal or hardship. Jesus, there is no way we are going to let this happen. Because if God is with you, if you're the Son of God, then this story isn't supposed to go this way. No, there's supposed to be more certainty, more faith, more miracles, more divine interventions. So Peter responds with boldness, saying, even if anyone else deserts you, I will never. But Jesus, this is not how the story is supposed to unfold. Even if everyone abandons you, I will not fall away. I will stand with you until the end. And yet, just a few hours later, the same man, the one who had all the faith in the world, would listen to a young servant girl accusing him of being one of Jesus' followers. And he would deny Jesus 3 times. This book, the Bible, is filled with stories and narratives written and lived out in times of extreme uncertainty. In fact, I would say that as families, as South African citizens, as different cultures, while we are currently facing incredible uncertainty like we've never experienced before, this is the perfect place to turn to, the Bible. Because your favorite Bible story, the story you grew up with, the story you've heard over and over, your favorite passage, your favorite psalm, perhaps even your favorite Proverbs, were written during times of extraordinary uncertainty. The Bible is not a book about wealthy people living in comfort. It's not a book about how things went well and then Monday got even better and then Tuesday I got a job and then Wednesday I got a promotion, Thursday I got a bonus, then my kids became professional athletes and studied medicine on scholarship. The Bible doesn't tell us stories of a wrinkle-free life where everyone lived happily ever after and there were no divorce in this land. No. Every single story, every passage, every piece of hope and certainty we drew from it comes from time of great uncertainty, times of hardship, struggles, troubled times. Every story in the Bible comes from the lives of people who discovered that in the midst of uncertainty, God remained certain. Even in uncertainty, when they couldn't see God's hand, when it seems like He was absent, to the highest degree, they discovered that God was reliable. And for all South Africans, if there was ever a time to pick up this book and read it, it is now. In this book, we find the story everyone knows, the story of Joseph, not Mary and Joseph, but the teenage Joseph in the Old Testament. And I know you had issues with your older brothers, but Joseph found himself in the bottom of a pit, listening to his brothers' conversations from above. Should we sell him or should we kill him? No, I don't know. Let's sell him. No, let's kill him. Listen, I realize you have sibling rivalry and there may be some problems at home over an inheritance. Or maybe your sister wear your blouse and didn't iron it afterwards and let it all crumpled on your bed, blah, blah, blah. I get it, it's unfair. But Joseph was at the bottom of a pit. Are you dealing with this kind of sibling rivalry? Where your brothers are debating whether to sell you or to kill you? And yet, when you read the story of Joseph, you discover, believe it or not, that God was actually with Joseph. Go see how Joseph's story ends. And then you read the story of King David, from whom the Messiah will ultimately come. And David wakes up one day, and I know you have problems with your kids, but David has to face the reality of his own son has raised an army and is marching towards the capital to dethrone him, to overthrow his own father as king. Has your children ever wanted you dead, genuinely? Sure, we all have problems with our children, but David's story is about a son who started an army to destroy his own father. But as you read the story, you discover that God was there in the midst of it all, walking with David. And then you hear stories of a mother who had a baby, son. And like any mother, she loved a child. But then she learned that Pharaoh has ordered a mass slaughter of all baby boys simply because there were too many Israelites in the land. And I know there are deep emotions surrounding babies and children. And that there are countless prayers for sick children. Many of us in ministry have buried far too many children. Yet, here is a mother wrapping a newborn son in a blanket and placed him in a basket, hiding him in the Nile River. As if to say, if my choices are crocodiles or Egyptian soldiers, I rather take the chance with the river. And you read the story and you discover God was there. The baby was found and they named him Moses. And he became the deliverer of the nation. But before the mother knew how the story would end, where was God in that uncertain moment? Then there's a similar story of a mother and father who heard that King Herod, jealous for his kingdom, had given orders for all Jewish baby boys to be killed. Why? Because Herod heard that a new king of the Jews had been born. So this mother and father, Mary and Joseph, had to flee Bethlehem and escape to Egypt of all places to protect the baby Jesus. And while there was weeping and mourning in the land, you read the story and discover that God was right in the middle of it all. Despite all the uncertainties we read about in the Bible, despite all the hardship, somehow God still had the whole world in his hands. Now here's a question for you and for me as we reflect on this. As we think about the extraordinary uncertainty in our families, in our workplaces, with our children or with our culture, as we face uncertainty in our country's leadership, our government officials, our economy, our retirement, our finances, with all this uncertainty, here's the real question. Can you trust God? Can you hold on to faith in God even when there is absolutely no evidence that He is working in your life? Can you trust God even with everything happening in South Africa right now? Can you trust God even if you are a victim of the corruption in our country? Your answer to this question will determine your response to the ongoing uncertainty you face. Your answer to this question will shape how you react to uncertainty in your life, in your family, with your children, with your parents. You see, I wonder where did we get the idea that we should equate God with prosperity? We've connected God's blessing with physical, tangible wealth. So when we don't experience positive things, we assume God is absent. We assume God's blessings are absent. But I think if you could go back to the disciples, the men who sat at that table with Jesus in the upper room, if you could ask them months after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, men, what was the darkest moment while following Jesus? When did you have the least hope? When did you start wondering, did we make a mistake in following Jesus? If we had to ask them that question, I am certain they would say, it began that night when we sat around the table and realized that things weren't going to get better. It was when we sat there and he told us that things would get worse. That not only would one of us betray him, but that all of us would flee. And just a few hours later, we all ran. Even the one man who said that he would never abandon him denied him 3 times. Then we saw him arrested. We saw him being dragged before the Jewish court. And then we saw him be killed. We saw him die. You want to know when our darkest hours were? It was those hours when we realized we had wasted our time. Our darkest moment was when we thought he lied to us. He wasn't from God. In fact, where was God? When Jesus died, where was God? And then if you could ask those same men another question. Okay, but when during your time with Jesus do you believe God did his greatest work? When was God working the hardest? Was it when the paralyzed man was healed? Or was it when the blind man regained his sight? That must have been amazing to see God's work physically in front of you. Or was it when you stood outside Lazarus' tomb? He had been dead for 4 days, and then you saw him walk out of there. Was that the moment when God was most present? When was God the most active? If we had to ask them that question, I'm convinced they would say, those same hours when it seemed like God was doing the least, those same hours when he seemed absent, those dark hours were the hours when God was doing his greatest work. And those dark hours when he seemed completely inactive, he was actually the most active. Because those darkest hours were the epicenter of the salvation of all humanity. Think about this. Today we celebrate those dark hours. And now we see nothing but God's goodness and grace in those dark hours. But if you had to ask us in those dark moments, we would have said, game over, man. It was all a waste of time. It's easy to say now that Jesus' crucifixion was a blessing for the whole world, right? It's easy to look back at dark times, but it's much harder when you are in dark times right now. Right now, in South Africa, right now, in our politics, with all the corruption and recklessness of our leaders, it's much harder to believe that God still has the whole world in his hands. But my friend, God's redemption story has never been one of comfort. No, God's salvation came in the moments when it seemed like he was absent. Every single time it has looked like God was completely gone, that was precisely when he was doing his greatest work. Every time it seemed hopeless, that was when God was working the hardest. And of course it's difficult for us, because it's not the way we would choose. We would never allow things to get as bad as they often do. But that's God's way. The greatest things begin in the greatest mess. God's most incredible work are often launched in times of personal and national brokenness. That's what God does. But the question for you and for me is, will we continue to believe even when we cannot see his hand? Or will our faith waver when things don't go how we want them to go? Will your faith be determined by circumstances or by a person, Jesus? Jesus showed us that even in the darkest of dark times, God was working the hardest. Jesus, who was crowned as the eternal King through times of darkness. Jesus, who proved that the darkest time were the beginning of God's ultimate salvation of humanity. Jesus, who came to show us that certainty lies in who God is, not in our circumstances. Our circumstances may be uncertain, but God is certain. And yes, Johnny, those are beautiful words, even a little inspiring, but they don't change my circumstances. They don't change the mess in South Africa. They don't help me find a job. They don't make me healthy. And yes, you're right, they don't. But although this idea, this insight, this truth about Scripture does not change your circumstances, here is what it does do. It enables you to embrace uncertainty with the certainty that God is still in control. That even if life is uncertain, God is never uncertain. Even if life, your family, the economy, or the world seems uncertain, God is not uncertain. He still holds the whole world in His hands. And knowing this, even if it's gripping onto it with your fingernails, knowing that God is still in control keeps you from making decisions that could make the problems you face even worse. It allows you to lay down at night, climb into bed, and, as we'll hear in a few weeks, find a way to have peace even in the middle of these storms. It will teach us to be more intentional about noticing the activity of God. That might just surprise us, just like it often surprised the characters in the Bible. So, hold on to it and embrace this simple truth. Even though life is uncertain, God is not uncertain. He still holds the whole world in His hands. Now, it's easy for me to sit here and say all this because I don't have to go through what you are going through right now. I don't have to get into my car and go back to your place. I don't have to return to your situation. I don't have to wake up tomorrow morning and wonder what I'm going to do. I recognize that our circumstances are all very different. So, what gives me the right to sit here and encourage you? To try and paint a picture of heaven's glory to you? I understand all of that. But can I remind you of Paul's words? Now, Paul was a man who knew dark times. Paul was unjustly thrown into prison multiple times. He was beaten multiple times. He was almost murdered multiple times. And yet, he says in Romans 8 verse 28, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love Him. God causes everything to work together for good. And I know my everything and your everything looks very different, but my friend, everything is everything. Even those things that you have absolutely no control over, that's part of everything. So something we must all come to understand is this. When life is uncertain, God is not. And He still holds the whole world in His hands. He still holds your whole world and your family in His hands. He still holds every personal struggle you are carrying in His hands. All the things that worry you to death, He holds in His hands. My friend, I don't know what the future holds for our nation, for our family, for our religion. I don't know any more than anyone else does. But here's what I do know. Even though life is uncertain, God is not. And He still holds the whole world in His hands. And regardless of what we see or don't see, we have the opportunity to embrace a faithful God, even in circumstances where it feels impossible to see His hand. My friend, despite of circumstances, God is still in control. God is still on the throne. God is still a God worthy of our worship. And He is still a God we can trust. Even if our lives are uncertain, He is not. He still holds the whole world, the whole of South Africa, in His hands.